At 6:42 p.m., in front of nearly 200 guests dressed in black tuxedos and silk gowns, a 48-year-old executive looked his own mother in the eye and told security to remove her from his wedding. The ballroom was glowing with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors, the kind of place built to celebrate legacy and success. And yet in the middle of all that luxury stood a 72-year-old woman in a faded coat, holding a small wrapped box against her chest, as if it were something fragile and sacred. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't beg. She simply adjusted her grip on that gift, nodded once, and walked past the guests who pretended not to stare. Less than 2 hours later, in a hospital hallway smelling of antiseptic and fear, a doctor would look at that same groom and say 7 words that would change the direction of his life. We can't save her without her. This is the story of pride, of consequences, and of the moment a man discovered that success can build a stage big enough for applause, but small enough to lose the people who carried you there. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a wedding turns into a reckoning, you have to understand the man at the center of it. He grew up in a small Midwestern town, the kind where Friday night football was the main event and factory shifts dictated the rhythm of life. His father left when he was 6, leaving his mother to work double shifts at a packaging plant, sometimes 16 hours at a time, so her son could have school clothes that didn't look secondhand and a chance at a future that stretched beyond county lines. According to U.S. Census data, nearly 1 in 4 children in America are raised in single-parent households, and families led by single mothers face significantly higher rates of economic hardship. He was one of those statistics, though he never liked thinking of himself that way. He preferred the word self-made. He carried resentment toward poverty like it was a stain that had to be scrubbed out of memory. When he earned a scholarship to a state university and later climbed the corporate ladder in a financial services firm, he began to reshape his story. He shortened his hometown on his resume, softened the rough edges of his upbringing, and introduced his mother at company events as someone who used to work in manufacturing, never mentioning the night shifts, the overtime, the exhaustion that had built the foundation under his success. By the time he met the woman he would marry, he was a senior vice president with a corner office and a salary that placed him comfortably in the top 10% of earners in his state. She came from a family of attorneys and developers, a lineage that valued tradition and presentation. The wedding was planned at a historic hotel known for hosting senators and CEOs, a venue where reputation seemed to hang in the air like perfume. Invitations were engraved. The guest list was curated. Every detail was designed to communicate stability, achievement, arrival. His mother received an invitation, but there had been quiet conversations beforehand about dress codes, about seating arrangements, about optics. He told her it would be formal, that she should wear something elegant. She told him she would manage. Social researchers have long noted that upward mobility can create emotional distance within families, especially when class differences become visible in public spaces. For him, that distance had widened over years of boardrooms and charity galas. He convinced himself that he was protecting his new life from embarrassment, that he was safeguarding an image he had worked decades to build. When she arrived that evening, she came alone. She had taken a bus from her town, then a taxi to the hotel. The coat she wore was clean but worn at the cuffs, and her shoes had been polished so carefully that the leather had begun to thin. She stood near the entrance for a moment, searching the crowd for her son's face. He saw her before she saw him. Witnesses would later say his expression tightened, that he looked like a man spotting a problem that needed immediate correction. He walked toward her quickly, his smile fading as he drew closer. Their conversation was brief and hushed, but the tension was visible. When he signaled to security, the room shifted. Some guests looked away. Others watched openly. Public humiliation has a way of freezing time, stretching seconds into something heavier. She tried to hand him the small box she had brought, telling him she just wanted to give it to him herself. He refused. The box slipped from her hands and hit the marble floor with a sound that echoed louder than it should have. She picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly, and then she walked out through doors that closed softly behind her. The ceremony continued. Vows were exchanged. Applause filled the room. Champagne glasses clinked in celebration. On the surface, the night remained intact, but stress has a way of surfacing when least expected. According to medical research published by the American College of Cardiology and other institutions, acute emotional stress can trigger serious physiological reactions, including stress-induced cardiomyopathy and severe inflammatory responses. Roughly 90 minutes after his mother left the building, his bride excused herself from a conversation, complaining of dizziness. Moments later, she collapsed. At first, some thought she had fainted from dehydration or nerves. But when she didn't regain consciousness quickly, panic replaced confusion. Paramedics arrived within minutes, weaving through tables still decorated with untouched centerpieces. He followed the stretcher out of the ballroom, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, his expression stripped of confidence. At the hospital, the atmosphere shifted from celebration to urgency. Tests were run. Blood panels were drawn. Imaging scans were ordered. The diagnosis, delivered with clinical calm, was severe acute liver failure brought on by an underlying autoimmune condition that had flared dramatically under extreme stress. In the United States, acute liver failure is rare, affecting only a few thousand people each year, but when it strikes, it can progress rapidly and become fatal without transplantation. The doctor explained that medication alone would not be enough. She needed a transplant, and she needed it quickly. Compatibility depended on blood type and several other factors, and the window for intervention was measured in hours, not days. He assured the medical team that money would not be a barrier. He spoke with the authority of a man accustomed to solving problems with resources. The doctor listened, then delivered the words that would replay in his mind for years. "We can't save her without her." He didn't understand at first. The doctor clarified. Earlier that evening, hospital records showed a registered organ donor with matching blood type, and preliminary compatibility factors had been within the vicinity. That donor was his mother. Years earlier, during a routine checkup when he himself had faced a minor health scare, she had undergone compatibility testing in case she was ever needed. She had insisted on it quietly, without telling him, because she believed a parent should always be prepared. The odds of a suitable match within immediate reach were slim. The fact that she had been at the wedding, then turned away, created a situation that felt almost unbearable in its irony. Surgeons warned that at her age, a major operation carried significant risk. Recovery would be long. Complications were possible. There were no guarantees for either woman. He left the hospital that night and drove to his mother's modest home, a place he had not visited in over a year. The porch light was on. Through the window, he could see her sitting at the kitchen table, the small wrapped box placed carefully beside her. When she opened the door, she looked smaller than he remembered, yet steady. He struggled to find words that could bridge the space he had created. For the first time in decades, he spoke to her without rehearsed confidence. He told her what the doctor had said. He told her there was a chance, but it came with danger. She listened without interruption. Then she asked a single question about his wife's condition. When he finished explaining, she nodded in the same quiet way she had at the hotel doors. She said their life together was just beginning and that if she could help secure that future, she would. There was no accusation in her voice, no demand for apology, only resolve. The surgery lasted hours. In operating rooms across the country, similar procedures carry mortality risks that surgeons do not take lightly, especially for older donors. The statistics are clear. Age increases surgical risk, and recovery can be slower and more complex. Yet thousands of living donors step forward each year in the United States, motivated by bonds that outweigh fear. In this case, the transplant was successful. His wife stabilized. His mother was moved to recovery, pale but alive. When he finally saw them both resting in separate rooms, the scale of what had nearly been lost settled over him with a weight far greater than any public embarrassment he had tried to avoid. Success had given him status, but it had almost cost him the person who sacrificed most to achieve it. In the weeks that followed, headlines never captured this story. There was no viral clip, no trending outrage. It unfolded quietly, within hospital walls and family conversations. He returned to the ballroom in his mind often, replaying the moment security stepped forward, replaying the sound of that small box hitting the floor. Inside it, he later discovered, was a simple watch that had belonged to his grandfather, engraved with a date marking the year his mother had been born. On the back, she had added a short inscription, "No matter how far you go, He began to understand that distance is not measured only in miles or income brackets. It is measured in pride, in silence, in the choices we make when image competes with loyalty. For men in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, who have built careers, families, and reputations over decades, the question lingers long after the hospital discharge papers are signed. What is the cost of protecting status if it means abandoning the hands that lifted you there? He learned that night that some lessons arrive in boardrooms, and others arrive in hospital corridors at 2 a.m., when a doctor reminds you that survival sometimes depends on the very person you tried to leave behind. Daniel Carter was 48 years old on the night he told security to escort his mother out of his wedding, a senior corporate executive who had spent more than 2 decades climbing from entry-level analyst to the upper floors of a national financial firm. In the ballroom that evening, he stood polished and composed, a man accustomed to closing multi-million-dollar deals, shaking hands with investors, and presenting himself as the embodiment of discipline and control. Linda Carter, 72, had once worked the night shift at a Midwestern factory that produced automotive parts, clocking in before sunset and leaving after dawn so her son could attend better schools than the ones assigned to their zip code. Emily Hayes, 38, the bride, was an attorney from a respected family, raised in a world of country clubs, alumni boards, and generational expectations. On paper, this wedding looked like the merging of success and stability, but beneath the surface were tensions that had been building for years. Why was Daniel ashamed of Linda Carter, the woman who had paid his tuition by sacrificing her own health? What exactly was said between mother and son in the minutes before security stepped forward? And how could it be that later that same night, a physician would insist that Linda Carter was the only person who could save Emily Hayes' life? Guests would later recall the moment Linda Carter appeared uncertain where to sit, scanning the seating chart as if searching for confirmation that she belonged. There was an empty chair near the back of the ballroom, positioned far from the immediate family tables, and some said that detail alone spoke volumes. Social mobility research in the United States has consistently shown that individuals who move from working-class backgrounds into upper-income circles often experience internal conflict about identity, particularly when family members visibly represent the life they left behind. Daniel Carter had spent years refining how he introduced himself, carefully omitting certain chapters, smoothing over others. To colleagues, he was the product of grit and ambition. To Linda Carter, he was still the boy who used to fall asleep at the kitchen table while she ironed his school shirts before her shift. Inside that ballroom, those two versions of Daniel Carter collided. Security footage later reviewed by hotel management would show a brief exchange near the entrance. Daniel leaning in close, his jaw tight. Linda Carter clutching a small wrapped box as if bracing against something heavier than rejection. And then there was Emily Hayes, whose collapse would transform a family dispute into a medical emergency. In the hours before she fell, she had been smiling for photographs, greeting guests, managing the small stresses that accompany any major ceremony. Acute stress responses, according to medical literature from institutions like the Mayo Clinic and Johns Hopkins, can trigger severe physiological reactions in individuals with underlying conditions, including autoimmune disorders that remain undiagnosed for years. When Emily Hayes suddenly grew pale and unsteady, few in the room understood that something far more serious than nerves was unfolding. As paramedics navigated through the crowd and Daniel Carter followed the stretcher into the night, the narrative shifted from reputation to survival. By the time doctors began discussing compatibility, organ failure, and the narrowing window for intervention, the earlier humiliation of Linda Carter took on a different weight. By the end of the night, Daniel wouldn't be protecting his reputation. He would be begging for mercy. To understand how Daniel Carter reached a point where he could look at Linda Carter and feel embarrassment instead of gratitude, you have to return to a small town in Ohio, where winter seemed longer than opportunity and factory whistles marked the hours more reliably than clocks. Daniel grew up in a 2-bedroom rental house with peeling paint and a furnace that rattled through the night. His father left when he was young, leaving Linda Carter to shoulder the mortgage payments, grocery bills, and school fees alone. Census data over the past 2 decades has consistently shown that single-parent households, particularly those led by women in industrial towns, face higher rates of economic instability and health neglect. Linda Carter became one of those quiet statistics, not because she lacked ambition, but because survival required endurance more than recognition. Daniel learned early that money equaled security, and security equaled respect. In high school, he worked construction during the summers, hauling lumber in the heat, saving every paycheck for textbooks and application fees. He watched other boys inherit pickup trucks while he borrowed work boots 2 sizes too big. The difference etched itself into him. When Daniel earned admission to a state university, it felt less like acceptance and more like escape. He studied finance, gravitating toward a world where numbers could be controlled and outcomes could be forecasted. Internships turned into job offers, and job offers turned into promotions. He relocated from Ohio to Chicago, then later to a major East Coast city where boardrooms replaced break rooms and tailored suits replaced work gloves. Over time, Daniel Carter didn't just build a career, he built distance. From poverty, from embarrassment, from where he came from. He adjusted his accent, refined his wardrobe, and curated the version of himself that colleagues would see. At networking events, he spoke about mentorship and strategic growth, rarely about the nights Linda Carter came home with blistered hands after double shifts at a textile plant. He learned how to read balance sheets and market trends, but he also learned how to compartmentalize the parts of his life that felt incompatible with the image he was constructing. Linda Carter's sacrifices were neither dramatic nor publicly acknowledged. They were steady, repetitive, and exhausting. She worked double shifts at the textile plant for nearly 20 years, standing for hours beside machines that roared so loudly conversations were impossible. Occupational health studies have long documented the toll of such labor on joints, hearing, and cardiovascular health. Yet Linda Carter postponed medical appointments because tuition bills came first. When Daniel needed a laptop for college, she picked up overtime. When his rent increased during his first internship, she refinanced her car. She skipped routine checkups and ignored persistent pain in her lower back because there was always something more urgent to fund. She never complained, at least not in ways Daniel allowed himself to hear. In his memory, she became background noise to his ambition, a constant presence that required no analysis because she was simply there. As Daniel's salary increased and his social circle shifted, subtle edits began appearing in his narrative. He described his upbringing as modest rather than poor. He referenced his mother's work as manufacturing management rather than factory labor. When colleagues asked about family visits, he mentioned busy schedules and distance. The transformation was gradual enough that even he could justify it as professionalism rather than denial. Research on upward mobility often notes a phenomenon sometimes called identity dissonance, where individuals navigating new socioeconomic spaces reshape personal history to align with present expectations. Daniel Carter embodied that tension. He convinced himself that minimizing Linda Carter's role was a strategic choice, a necessary adjustment in competitive environments. But as Daniel climbed higher, he started editing his past in more deliberate ways. The wedding invitation, embossed in gold script, listed immediate family with careful precision. There was no +1 extended to Linda Carter, no prominent seat reserved at the front. It was a small detail on paper, yet it signaled something larger. In Daniel Carter's carefully curated future, Linda Carter occupied less and less space. By the time Linda Carter stepped through the revolving doors of the hotel, the ceremony had already begun to settle into its rhythm of polished smiles and rehearsed gratitude. She wore the best coat she owned, a navy wool piece she had purchased years earlier on clearance, its sleeves slightly frayed despite careful mending. The ballroom shimmered under chandeliers that reflected off crystal glasses and silver cutlery, and for a brief moment she stood still, absorbing the scale of a world that seemed designed for people other than her. A few guests noticed her immediately. Conversations softened. Eyes lingered a second too long. In rooms built on status, difference has a way of announcing itself without a word being spoken. Emily Hayes, radiant in white, caught sight of Linda Carter from across the room and leaned toward Daniel Carter with a question in her eyes. Daniel's posture stiffened. He set down his glass and walked toward his mother with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Witnesses later described the exchange as quiet but tense. Daniel Carter guided Linda Carter a few steps away from the nearest tables, lowering his voice. She held out the small wrapped box, explaining she had taken the early bus to make sure she wouldn't be late. Daniel glanced toward colleagues from his firm, then back at her coat, her shoes, the familiar details he had spent years distancing himself from. "You shouldn't be here," he said, the words clipped and controlled. Linda Carter blinked as if she had misheard him. She reminded him she was his mother. He told her this wasn't the time, that the guest list had been finalized, that appearances mattered. As tension tightened between them, a member of the hotel's security staff approached, responding to Daniel's subtle gesture. The symbolism was unmistakable. Linda Carter's hand trembled, and the small wrapped box slipped from her fingers, hitting the marble floor with a sharp, echoing sound that cut through nearby conversations. For a split second, the room felt suspended. Daniel Carter did not bend to pick up the gift. Security stepped closer, maintaining professional distance but clear intent. Linda Carter stooped slowly, retrieving the box and brushing off its corner as if preserving dignity through small gestures. She looked at her son one last time, searching for hesitation, for reversal, for anything that suggested this was a misunderstanding. None came. Without raising her voice, without creating a scene that might damage the polished evening Daniel Carter had orchestrated, she turned and walked toward the exit. The doors closed softly behind her, sealing off the moment as guests resumed their conversations in cautious tones. That could have been the end of it, a painful but private fracture buried beneath wedding photographs and curated memories. But at 8:17 p.m., less than 90 minutes after Linda Carter disappeared into the night, Emily Hayes gripped the edge of a table, her smile fading as dizziness overtook her. She collapsed before anyone could steady her, and within minutes the glow of chandeliers was replaced by the flashing lights of an ambulance outside the hotel entrance. The ambulance ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and fractured thoughts, Daniel Carter gripping Emily Hayes' hand as paramedics relayed vital signs over the radio. By the time they reached the emergency department, the celebration that had defined the evening felt distant, almost unreal. Monitors were attached, blood was drawn, and specialists were called in with the urgency reserved for cases that can shift from critical to fatal in a matter of hours. After a battery of tests and imaging, a hepatologist delivered the explanation with measured clarity. Emily Hayes was experiencing acute liver failure, most likely triggered by an autoimmune flare intensified by extreme emotional stress. In the United States, acute liver failure is rare but devastating, progressing rapidly and often requiring immediate transplantation to prevent irreversible damage. The doctor explained that medication alone would not reverse the deterioration. The only viable option was an emergency liver transplant. A rare match was needed, and the window for survival was narrowing to less than 24 hours. Daniel Carter listened, his executive instincts taking over as he asked about private registries, air transport, nationwide donor searches. "Money isn't an issue," he said, his voice steady but edged with desperation. The physician met his gaze and responded calmly. "This isn't about money. Compatibility depended on blood type, tissue markers, and timing, not bank accounts. Coordinating a deceased donor organ within such a limited time frame would be difficult." Then the doctor paused, reviewing notes on a tablet before looking back at Daniel Carter. "We can't save her without her." Daniel's confusion was immediate and visible. He asked who her referred to, assuming perhaps a specialist or a previously unidentified donor. The explanation was not yet fully laid out, but the implication was unmistakable. The match they needed, the one with the highest probability of success under such tight constraints, had already been in the building earlier that night. What followed felt less like a family conversation and more like an investigation, the kind where evidence replaces emotion and probabilities carry more weight than pride. The transplant coordinator pulled up compatibility charts, explaining that successful living liver donation depends first on blood type alignment, then on tissue markers, organ size ratios, and overall health stability. Roughly 1 in 3 immediate family members may share compatible blood types, but full suitability narrows significantly once additional medical criteria are applied. Genetic proximity increases the statistical likelihood of compatibility, particularly between parent and child, yet age introduces measurable risk. At 72, Linda Carter would fall into a higher-risk surgical category. Studies published in transplant journals indicate that complication rates rise with donor age and recovery times lengthen. The doctors did not soften these realities. They outlined them carefully, aware that informed consent must be grounded in data, not emotion. Then came the detail that shifted the room from clinical to personal. Years earlier, during a minor cardiac scare Daniel Carter experienced in his early 40s, Linda Carter had quietly asked her physician about donor testing, insisting on preliminary compatibility screening in case her son ever needed an organ. She never told Daniel Carter. She never mentioned the blood panels, the tissue typing, the evaluation appointments. She completed them, received confirmation that she was medically compatible for potential liver donation, and filed the information away as something she hoped would never be required. According to the hospital's electronic registry, her status as a compatible living donor had been logged and updated during routine checkups. She had prepared for a crisis Daniel Carter did not even remember fearing. The doctor looked at him now and confirmed the numbers. Linda Carter's blood type matched Emily Hayes'. The tissue markers aligned within acceptable thresholds. Statistically, she was the strongest candidate available within the critical time frame. She had been ready for years. Daniel Carter stood silent, absorbing the reality that the woman he had just removed from his wedding reception had already positioned herself, quietly and without recognition, as the one person most likely to save his wife's life. Daniel Carter left the hospital just after midnight, the doctor's words repeating in his mind with relentless clarity. The drive to Linda Carter's house felt longer than the bus ride she had taken to attend his wedding. When he pulled into the familiar driveway, the porch light was still on, casting a quiet glow over the steps he had climbed thousands of times as a child. Through the front window, he could see Linda Carter seated at the kitchen table, her phone propped against a salt shaker, the muted replay of the wedding livestream flickering across the screen. She had not removed her coat. The small wrapped box sat unopened beside her, as if the evening had paused rather than ended. Daniel Carter stood at the door longer than he intended, wrestling with a pride that had defined much of his adult life. When she opened it, her expression was calm, almost expectant, as though she understood that the night was not finished with them. For the first time in decades, Daniel Carter did not speak as an executive or as a groom concerned with optics. His voice faltered. "Mom, I need your help." The words felt unfamiliar, stripped of authority. He explained Emily Hayes' condition, the urgency, the compatibility results. He did not hide the risks this time. At 72, major surgery carried significant danger. The doctors had been direct. Recovery would be difficult, complications possible, outcomes uncertain. Linda Carter listened without interruption. The live stream of the wedding still paused on a frame of Daniel standing at the altar. She asked only one question about Emily Hayes' chances if the transplant succeeded. When Daniel answered, she nodded slowly. "Their life is just beginning," she said, her tone steady and resolute. For men who measure legacy in what they build and leave behind, the weight of that statement was unmistakable. Linda Carter was not speaking about reputation or wealth. She was speaking about continuity, about the future Daniel Carter had tried so hard to secure, and about the role she was willing to play in protecting it, even now. The consent forms were signed before sunrise. Surgeons briefed Daniel Carter in measured tones, outlining once more the statistical risks tied to Linda Carter's age and the urgency created by Emily Hayes' rapidly declining liver function. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic declarations in the operating corridor, only a sequence of clinical steps that would determine whether two lives could move forward together. Linda Carter was wheeled into surgery first, composed and quiet, offering Daniel Carter a look that carried more reassurance than fear. Emily Hayes was prepared in a separate operating room, her condition stabilized just enough to attempt the transplant. Hours passed in a waiting area where time seemed detached from clocks. Daniel Carter sat alone, replaying the events of the night not as a corporate executive analyzing outcomes, but as a son confronting the cost of his own decisions. When the lead surgeon finally emerged, the expression was professional but steady. The transplant had been technically successful. Emily Hayes' body was responding. Linda Carter was stable, though the strain of the procedure meant recovery would be gradual and closely monitored. There was no immediate celebration, only cautious relief. In the days that followed, Emily Hayes regained consciousness, her prognosis improving incrementally. Linda Carter remained hospitalized longer, her strength returning slowly, each step in physical therapy a reminder of both sacrifice and resilience. The final image was not of a wedding ballroom or a boardroom, but of Daniel Carter seated beside Linda Carter's hospital bed, jacket folded over a chair, tie loosened, posture softened. Not CEO, not groom, just son. Pride builds walls, but life has a way of tearing them down. The question isn't whether Daniel loved his mother. It's why it took almost losing everything to remember it.